Welcome. Tonight's story pulls us deep into the shadowed heart of a southern plantation, where a powerful owner made a decision so cruel it still echoes through history. He handed his own obese daughter to a slave, and what followed left everyone speechless. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from in the comments, and subscribe if you value stories built on careful research, because uncovering true historical details takes serious time, cross-checking records, and separating myth from fact, and this story demanded every bit of that effort. The plantation functioned like a carefully constructed illusion of order, where every person was ranked, watched, and controlled. At the top stood the owner, whose word carried the weight of law, and beneath him flowed a rigid ladder of power that decided who ate well, who slept indoors, and who could speak without punishment. This hierarchy was not written on paper alone. It was carved into daily routines, enforced through fear, and accepted as natural by those who benefited from it. Enslaved people existed at the lowest level of this structure, stripped of identity and reduced to labor and obedience. Their lives were measured in productivity, not humanity, and any resistance, real or imagined, was met with brutal consequences. Even overseers, though free, lived under constant pressure, knowing that one mistake could cost them their position or provoke violent retribution from the owner. Within this hierarchy, women occupied a particularly dangerous space. Enslaved women were treated as property twice over, first as workers, and again as bodies others felt entitled to control. But even the owner's daughter, despite her status, was not fully protected. Her value was tied to obedience, appearance, and usefulness, and once she failed to meet those expectations, her position in the hierarchy became fragile. Her obesity, seen not as a medical condition, but as a moral failure, quietly pushed her down the social ladder inside her own home. Whispers followed her through hallways, servants avoided eye contact, and family gatherings turned cold. In a system obsessed with control and perfection, her body was viewed as a problem to be corrected rather than a person to be cared for. Power on the plantation flowed downward through humiliation. The owner maintained authority not only by punishing slaves, but by demonstrating that no one, family included, was beyond his reach. This created an atmosphere where cruelty became proof of strength and mercy was mistaken for weakness. Each act of dominance reinforced the hierarchy, making it feel unbreakable. The enslaved men and women understood this structure better than anyone. They learned when to look away, when to remain silent, and when survival required witnessing horrors without reaction. The hierarchy taught them that speaking the truth could be fatal, and that even observing too closely could invite suspicion. By the time the owner made his unthinkable decision, the plantation was already primed for it. The hierarchy had done its work, dulling empathy, normalizing abuse, and convincing everyone within its borders that power justified everything. What followed was not an accident. It was the inevitable result of a system designed to crush humanity at every level. The owner's decision did not come from sudden madness, but from a long pattern of calculated control. On the plantation, every problem, human or otherwise, was solved through dominance. Crops that failed were replaced, slaves who resisted were punished or sold, and family members who embarrassed him were treated no differently. In his mind, authority meant ownership, and ownership meant the right to decide another person's fate without explanation. His daughter had become, in his eyes, a liability. Her body drew attention, her presence invited gossip, and her refusal, or inability, to conform threatened the image he worked obsessively to maintain. Rather than seeing her as a child in need of care, he viewed her as a flaw in his carefully crafted world. The plantation owner believed that discipline, no matter how extreme, could correct anything. He convinced himself that this act was practical, even necessary. By involving a slave, he reinforced the social order while distancing himself from responsibility. If something went wrong, blame could be shifted downward, as it always was. The decision was framed as punishment, lesson, and solution all at once. A single act meant to restore his sense of control. Those closest to him sensed something dark unfolding, but dared not interfere. The household staff lowered their eyes, and overseers followed orders without questions. On a plantation, hesitation was dangerous, and compassion could be mistaken for defiance. Silence became the safest response, even as fear thickened the air. The slave chosen for this role was not asked, he was commanded. Refusal was unthinkable, and compliance carried its own terror. The owner's decision trapped him in an impossible position where survival meant obedience, and obedience meant becoming part of something deeply wrong. In that moment, the hierarchy tightened like a noose around everyone involved. For the daughter, the decision stripped away any remaining sense of protection. She was no longer a family member, but a problem to be handled. The authority that should have shielded her was the same force that condemned her, turning blood ties into something meaningless. This calculated choice revealed the true nature of power on the plantation. It was not about order or tradition, but about domination without limits. By making this decision, the owner crossed a line that could not be undone, setting in motion consequences that would scar bodies, memories, and the land itself. Isolation closed in around her long before the owner's decision was spoken aloud. She lived in the same grand house, yet felt cut off from it, moving through rooms where conversations stopped the moment she entered. Meals were taken in silence, glances were quick and judgmental, and even familiar spaces began to feel hostile. Loneliness became a constant companion, heavier than the walls that surrounded her. Her body became the reason for that isolation. Instead of concern or care, it invited ridicule and shame, whispered behind doors, and carried through the plantation like a quiet disease. Servants repeated what they overheard. Overseers mocked when they thought no one important was listening, and even distant relatives treated her as an embarrassment best ignored. She learned quickly that being seen was more painful than being alone. The isolation was emotional as much as it was physical. She had no one to confide in, no safe place where fear could be spoken without consequence. Any attempt to express distress was dismissed as weakness or ingratitude. In a household ruled by authority, vulnerability had no value, and suffering was expected to be endured without complaint. Days blurred together as her world shrank. She avoided mirrors, stayed out of common areas, and limited her movements to avoid becoming the subject of fresh cruelty. The plantation was vast, yet her life narrowed to a few quiet corners where she could exist without being judged. Even there, She never felt truly safe. This isolation made her defenseless. Cut off from allies and stripped of dignity, she had no power to resist decisions made about her. The silence surrounding her was not accidental, it was cultivated. By keeping her isolated, the owner ensured there would be no witnesses willing to speak on her behalf, no voices to challenge his authority. For the enslaved people who observed this from a distance, her isolation was a warning. If the owner could discard his own daughter so completely, then no one was beyond his reach. Her loneliness became another tool of control, reinforcing fear throughout the plantation. By the time the final decision came, isolation had already done its damage. It had weakened her spirit, erased her sense of belonging, and prepared the ground for what followed. In that silence, humanity was slowly stripped away, leaving behind a person surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. Dehumanization was the plantation owner's most effective weapon, because it allowed cruelty to feel justified. By stripping people of their humanity, he transformed suffering into management and violence into routine. Enslaved individuals were reduced to numbers, tasks, and bodies spoken about as tools rather than lives. This mindset made it easier to issue orders that would otherwise be unthinkable. Over time, this way of thinking spread through the plantation like poison. Overseers copied it to maintain favor, household staff adopted it to protect themselves, and silence became a form of participation. When people are spoken of as less than human, empathy fades, and obedience replaces conscience. Dehumanization turned moral wrongs into simple instructions. The owner did not reserve this treatment only for slaves. When his daughter failed to meet his expectations, he began to speak of her in the same detached manner. She was no longer a person with emotions or fear, but a problem to be fixed. In his world, value was conditional, and once that value was questioned, humanity could be revoked. By dehumanizing her, he reclaimed power. Seeing her pain meant acknowledging responsibility, so instead he erased her individuality. This allowed him to act without guilt, convincing himself that he was correcting a flaw rather than harming a human being. Power, in this form, depended on emotional distance. For the enslaved people forced to witness this, the message was terrifyingly clear. If even blood relations could be reduced to objects, then their own lives were endlessly disposable. Dehumanization reinforced obedience by reminding everyone that resistance could lead to complete erasure of identity. The slave drawn into the owner's plan was dehumanized in a different way. He was treated as an instrument of punishment, not a person capable of choice or morality. By denying his agency, the owner avoided seeing him as responsible or himself as cruel. Power thrived on this deliberate blindness. In the end, dehumanization did more than justify one act, it sustained an entire system. It allowed authority to operate without limits and silenced any challenge before it could form. What happened next was not just an individual tragedy, but the result of a world where power depended on denying humanity itself. The slave was placed into a position where no choice truly existed. On the plantation, orders from the owner were absolute, and refusal was often met with severe punishment or death. Being singled out meant attention, and attention was dangerous. He understood immediately that whatever this command involved, it would leave him marked forever. Fear guided every thought. Obedience might keep him alive, but it would bind him to an act he could never escape mentally. Disobedience, on the other hand, promised swift and brutal consequences, not just for him, but possibly for others connected to him. The plantation system was designed to trap people in these impossible decisions, where survival itself became a form of guilt. He was denied the right to question or explain. His humanity, like that of so many others, was irrelevant to the owner. In that moment, he was not seen as a man with thoughts or morals, but as a tool meant to carry out another man's will. The weight of that realization was crushing. The power imbalance was absolute. The owner held control over his body, his future, and his very existence. Any personal values he carried had to be buried deep, because the plantation allowed no space for conscience. The system forced him into silence, knowing that even a look of hesitation could be interpreted as defiance. What made the situation even more unbearable was the awareness that he would be blamed no matter the outcome. If harm occurred, responsibility would fall on him. If he tried to protect her, punishment would still follow. The structure of power ensured that those at the bottom absorbed all consequences, while those at the top remained untouched. This impossible position stripped him of agency. He was trapped between fear and morality, between survival and shame. The plantation owner's order was not just an act of cruelty toward his daughter, but a calculated way to further break the spirit of an enslaved man. In forcing this role upon him, the system revealed its deepest cruelty. It did not merely exploit labor, it destroyed the ability to choose right from wrong. The slave was left carrying a burden that was never his to bear, proving that the plantation's true violence extended far beyond physical punishment and into the soul itself. Silence on the plantation was not natural, it was enforced. Everyone understood that speaking at the wrong moment could destroy a life. Words carried consequences, and even questions could be seen as challenges to authority. Over time, this fear trained people to swallow their reactions, no matter how disturbing what they witnessed became. When the owner's decision spread in whispers, no one spoke openly about it. Eyes averted, footsteps slowed, and conversations ended abruptly when certain names were mentioned. The absence of discussion was itself a warning. Silence became a shared agreement for survival, a way to signal loyalty without ever saying it aloud. Punishment did not always need to be visible to be effective. Stories of past consequences circulated quietly, someone sent away, someone beaten, someone never seen again. These memories kept mouths shut and heads down. Fear lived in these unspoken histories, guiding behavior more powerfully than any threat spoken directly. The enslaved people were especially aware of this danger. Speaking the truth could be interpreted as accusation, and accusation invited retaliation. Even sympathy was risky. To acknowledge suffering was to recognize injustice, and recognizing injustice challenged the very foundation of the plantation's power. Those who lived in the main house were trapped by a different kind of fear. Their status depended entirely on obedience, and questioning the owner meant risking exile or ruin. Silence protected their comfort, even as it cost them their conscience. In this way, fear united everyone, though unequally, under the same oppressive rule. The silence surrounding the event allowed it to unfold without resistance. No witnesses stepped forward, no objections were raised, and no records were kept. What was not spoken could not be challenged, and what was not written could later be denied. Silence became a shield for power. In the end, fear did exactly what it was designed to do. It erased voices, buried truth, and ensured that the plantation's authority remained unbroken. The quiet that followed was not peace. It was the sound of a system succeeding in protecting itself at the cost of humanity. What remained afterward was not spoken of directly, but the body told its own story. Changes were noticed before explanations were offered, marks that had not been there before, a posture altered by pain, a presence that seemed diminished. On a plantation where words were dangerous, the physical form became the only proof that something irreversible had occurred. People observed in fragments. A servant glimpsed her struggling to walk. An overseer noticed her absence from spaces she once occupied. Enslaved workers, trained to read danger in the smallest details, understood that her body now carried a message no one dared translate aloud. Evidence did not need to be declared to be understood. The owner avoided looking too closely, as if sight itself could accuse him. Acknowledging what the body revealed would mean admitting responsibility, and responsibility threatened his authority. Instead, he chose denial, allowing rumors to circulate while he maintained the appearance of control. The truth was left to live in whispers and glances. For the enslaved man, the body became a burden of memory. Every visible change was a reminder of the impossible position he had been forced into. He carried the weight of blame without ever having been granted choice. The evidence existed, but the system ensured it pointed downward, never up. Pain altered more than flesh. Her movements grew cautious, her presence quieter, as though she were trying to take up less space in the world. The body reflected not only physical harm, but the collapse of safety and trust. It became a record of power exercised without restraint. Because there were no records, no confessions, and no witnesses willing to speak, the body stood alone as testimony. It contradicted the plantation's carefully maintained image of order and discipline. Yet without words to support it, that testimony could be ignored, dismissed, or rewritten. In this way, the body became both evidence and silence. It carried the truth while being denied a voice, and within a system designed to protect authority above all else, that truth was allowed to fade into history, visible, undeniable, and yet officially unseen. As time passed, the story began to split into two versions, what people whispered and what little could be traced through fragments of records. Rumors traveled faster than facts, shaped by fear, imagination, and the need to explain what no one was allowed to confirm. Each retelling added new details or removed inconvenient ones, blurring the line between truth and survival-driven fiction. Among the enslaved community, the rumors carried warnings rather than curiosity. They focused less on spectacle and more on consequence, who had power, who suffered, and who would be blamed. These versions stayed close to lived experience, shaped by an understanding of how authority operated. Accuracy mattered less than the lesson. No one was safe. Within the owner's circle, the story shifted again. Here, rumors were softened, rewritten as discipline gone wrong or unfortunate circumstance. Responsibility was diluted through vague language, and the most disturbing elements were quietly erased. This version protected reputations and preserved the illusion of control. Written records, where they existed at all, were carefully limited. Plantations documented property, productivity, and profit, not suffering. What could not be framed as loss or gain was excluded. Absence in the records became a form of denial, allowing future generations to claim ignorance. The gap between rumor and record grew wider with time. Historians searching later would find inconsistencies, missing dates, and unexplained changes. These gaps were not accidents, they were the result of deliberate silence. Power decided what deserved to be remembered and what was allowed to disappear. For those who lived through it, the truth existed in memory rather than ink. Memory, however, is fragile, especially when speaking it could once mean death. As witnesses aged or were lost, their truths faded with them, leaving behind only echoes. In the end, history was left with fragments. Rumors hinted at something terrible, while records remained clean and incomplete. Between them sat the real story, damaged, obscured, but not entirely gone, waiting for careful eyes to recognize that what was missing spoke just as loudly as what remained. Punishment on the plantation did not require an audience. In fact, it was often more effective when hidden. Acts carried out away from witnesses left space for fear to grow unchecked, because no one knew exactly how far authority would go. Uncertainty became part of the punishment itself, shaping behavior long after the act was done. Those involved understood that consequences would fall unevenly. Power determined guilt, not truth. The owner's position guaranteed protection, while anyone beneath him absorbed blame by default. Justice was never about fairness. It was about preserving hierarchy. The absence of witnesses ensured that accountability could never climb upward. For the enslaved man, this meant living under the constant threat of punishment without defense. Even if he followed every order exactly, he could still be accused if the outcome displeased the owner. With no one to testify on his behalf, he existed in a state of permanent vulnerability. Survival depended on remaining invisible and compliant. The daughter, too, faced punishment without acknowledgement. What she endured was not recognized as harm, but as correction. Without witnesses willing or able to speak, her suffering was reframed as necessity. The system denied her the status of a victim by refusing to name what had happened. Others on the plantation learned from this silence. They saw how punishment could occur without explanation, how consequences appeared without cause. This reinforced obedience more effectively than public displays of violence. Fear thrives where logic and transparency are absent. Because there were no witnesses, there was no official version of events to challenge. The story could be reshaped at will, shifting responsibility downward or erasing it entirely. Truth required voices, and voices had been systematically removed. In the end, punishment without witnesses ensured that power remained untouched. It protected those at the top while isolating those who suffered below. What happened became both undeniable and unprovable, a perfect outcome for a system designed to dominate without ever being questioned. Authority on the plantation had long since lost any connection to morality. Power was exercised for its own sake, measured not by justice but by obedience. Decisions were made to assert dominance, not to protect or guide. Over time, This collapse of moral responsibility became so normalized that cruelty no longer felt extreme. It felt routine. The owner's actions reflected this decay. What should have been unthinkable became permissible once authority went unquestioned. When no one can challenge power, it stops needing reasons. Right and wrong blur, replaced by what can be done versus what cannot be resisted. In such an environment, moral limits simply dissolve. Those who benefited from the system adapted quickly. They learned to separate themselves emotionally from the consequences of their obedience. Following orders became a way to avoid guilt, even as it contributed to harm. Moral collapse did not happen all at once. It happened through small compromises repeated daily. For those without power, the collapse was felt differently. They were forced to live inside decisions they did not make, suffering outcomes they could not influence. Morality became irrelevant to survival. When existence depends on submission, ethical choice is a luxury few can afford. The tragedy lay not only in what was done, but in how easily it was accepted. No collective outrage followed, no reckoning occurred. The absence of resistance signaled that authority had fully replaced conscience. A system that should have protected life instead consumed it. Even afterward, reflection was avoided. Admitting moral failure would require acknowledging responsibility, and responsibility threatened the foundation of authority. So denial took its place. The plantation continued to function, proving that efficiency can coexist with profound ethical decay. This was the true collapse, not of order, but of humanity within power. When authority exists without moral restraint, it becomes indistinguishable from violence. What unfolded was not an exception to the system, but a clear expression of what that system had already become. The aftermath did not arrive with confrontation or justice. It came quietly, settling over the plantation like a heavy fog. Life resumed its routines, bells rang, fields were worked, and orders were given as if nothing had changed. On the surface, the system appeared intact, but beneath it, something had fractured. People moved differently now, more cautiously, as though the ground itself could no longer be trusted. The daughter's presence diminished. Whether through absence or withdrawal, she became a reminder no one wished to acknowledge. When she was seen, eyes turned away quickly, not out of kindness but avoidance. Her existence disrupted the illusion that authority was clean and controlled. Ignoring her was easier than confronting what her condition represented. Among the enslaved people, the atmosphere grew heavier. Fear deepened, but so did understanding. They recognized the event not as an isolated cruelty, but as confirmation of what power was capable of. Trust, already fragile, eroded further. Survival strategies shifted, silence thickened, and hope narrowed. The enslaved man involved carried the heaviest weight. Even if no punishment followed immediately, the threat never disappeared. He lived under scrutiny, aware that any misstep could reopen the wound. His role in the aftermath was to endure, unseen, unacknowledged, and forever marked by something he never chose. Within the owner's household, relationships changed subtly but permanently. Authority became colder, less personal. Fear replaced familiarity, even among those who had once felt secure. The event served as a warning: loyalty did not guarantee protection. Control was absolute and affection conditional. There was no reckoning, no attempt to heal or repair. The system did not pause to reflect. It moved forward, grinding down whatever resisted. The lack of consequence reinforced the belief that power was untouchable. Injustice, left unchallenged, became precedent. The plantation endured, but it was altered. What remained was not order, but a quieter, darker version of it, one shaped by unspoken knowledge. The aftermath was not closure, it was continuation, and in that continuation, the damage spread, embedding itself into every interaction, every silence, and every step taken on that land. History has a way of hiding what makes it uncomfortable. Over time, stories like this were softened, shortened, or erased entirely, replaced by cleaner narratives of tradition and order. What did not fit the image of dignity and control was pushed aside, left to decay in rumor and fragmented memory. Truth became something inconvenient rather than something sacred. Those in power had the ability to decide what survived on paper. Records focused on land, wealth, and lineage, while suffering was treated as background noise. By choosing what to document and what to omit, history was shaped to protect reputations rather than reveal reality. Silence became an editorial choice. Generations that followed inherited these gaps without knowing why they existed. Missing explanations were accepted as coincidence, and unanswered questions faded with time. Without context, cruelty lost its sharp edges, and injustice was reframed as complexity. What was buried stayed buried, because no one was taught where to dig. For the descendants of the powerless, the truth survived differently. It lived in warnings, fragmented stories, and emotions passed down without names attached to them. These memories lacked dates and signatures, but they carried weight. Even when details blurred, the sense of harm remained clear. The danger of buried truth is repetition. When history is sanitized, its lessons are lost. Systems of power can be rebuilt under new names, using the same logic and producing the same damage. Forgetting does not erase harm, it only removes resistance to it. Uncovering such truths requires discomfort. It means reading between lines, questioning absences, and listening to voices that were never meant to be preserved. The past resists this kind of examination because it threatens the stories people prefer to believe about themselves and their foundations. Yet the truth, no matter how deeply buried, leaves traces. In silences, in contradictions, and in the unease that surrounds certain histories, it waits. To confront it is not to rewrite the past, but to finally acknowledge it, and in doing so, deny it the power to repeat itself unseen.